This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. It is April 9th, 1865. The North Lawn, the White House. The tall president addresses a jubilant gathering with a band because the word has come from Appomattox Courthouse. Lee has surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. The war in the North, not entirely tucked up. There's still action and battle out there, but the war is done for Mr. Lincoln. And in his remarks, he touches upon their possibility, imminent possibility, of there being the vote for well-educated freedmen or men who served in the Union Army, African Americans. About 10% of the Union Army at the end was African American, the colored troops they were called. This scene launches a conversation about a new book I highly recommend, Sheridan's Secret Mission, How the South Won the War After the War. I welcome the author, Robert Bob Cwiklik. And Bob, we go immediately to that scene. What was Lincoln thinking? What do we know now about his preparation for those remarks on the night of jubilation, knowing that we know that he would be gone in 3 days? Good evening to you.
Hi, it's great to be here with you. We can surmise a couple of things easily. He was standing in front of a very happy crowd of people. The knowledge that the war was ending and had drawn a lot of people to the lawn of the White House to hear Lincoln's remarks. And so he was responding to, trying to congratulate the troops, et cetera, and just express a feeling of a positive feeling that this is a moment to build on. And it's not clear, I think the remarks that you're referring to, I'm not sure how much he meant to rest the entire message on these remarks, but it was notable that he said that he now thought that voting rights should be given to African Americans who served in the Union Army and other African Americans who had demonstrated an aptitude for basically independent living after the war. He put it rather condescendingly. He was like, the more intelligent African Americans. But he was addressing it that way because there was a controversy between him and other members of his Republican Party who were more aggressive in wanting to see the vote awarded to African Americans in the South, particularly because they foresaw that when the Confederate soldiers returned home after the war, they looked at them as basically traitors, and they wanted to have a strong loyal element in the Southern states, or they thought that Reconstruction, reknitting the Union together, would have a very much more difficult prospect if there weren't more loyal citizens empowered to help.
Two of those loyal citizens had visited the president in February of 1864, more than a year before. It's important to mention them because they come from New Orleans. They're free men of color, which is the terminology that was used at the time, Jean-Baptiste Roudinet and Arnold Berthenot. They are publishers, they are intellectuals. What did they tell Mr. Lincoln? And
I'm sorry, that's an excellent point, and I wish I had mentioned that. Louisiana was notable in that period for having a very large population of what were known at the time as free men of color. They were part African American, and they were free before the Civil War, and many of them were very well educated, and two of them were advocates of Black suffrage even before the war was officially over, because in Louisiana at the time, much of Louisiana was occupied by Union troops well before the war was over. And as part of their effort to secure the vote in occupied Louisiana for Black people, for free men of color at the time, and looking ahead to the post-war period for Black people in general, they visited Lincoln on a. They took a trip to Washington, and Lincoln was quite impressed with them. And the day after they left their audience with him, he notified the provisional governor of Louisiana that he might want to consider, as they reconstructed the government there in the parts that were occupied by the Union, that they might want to consider allowing certain African Americans to have the franchise. That we might find that in the days ahead, we need that loyal element to help. I forget how exactly he put it, to protect the jewel of liberty, or something poetic.
Jewel of liberty, that's the phrase he used. Very nice.
So he may well have had that encounter with those two free men of color from Louisiana on his mind when he spoke to the jubilant crowd right after Appomattox.
We're looking at ambition by New Orleans, especially one of the great cities of America at the time, dominating the South. It had been, as Bob says, liberated since '62 and occupied by Union troops, part of the strategy to cut the Confederacy in half, the Mississippi. But in '65, it has governors, and part of their apparatus now is to write a new state constitution. And that state constitution is going to be informed not just by the returning Confederates or men who'd lived there. Remember, only men had the vote in '65. This is a long way from where we are now. But also informed on the fact that there's suddenly going to be tens of thousands of African Americans who are free to vote. And that's going to be influencing heavily in the new state constitution, where Black suffrage is the issue. Bob makes a special point here that Louisiana is one of 5 Confederate states that has more than 50% population of African American. That's very important, because therein lies the contest. Louisiana, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina, more than 50%. Louisiana is one of them, and Lincoln sees how important it is right away. Berthiaume and Roudinet and their colleagues form a newspaper. Eventually, it's first in French language, but eventually it's in English, the New Orleans Tribune, and they advocate in the open for Black suffrage. Is that correct, Bob? It
is indeed. It was probably their signature issue. And I didn't want to get confused with the issue of the paper, but it was their big issue. And at the time, Lincoln was tentatively endorsing Black suffrage. It was very controversial, and he was literally assassinated days later. And his assassin was in the crowd and heard his words and was very angry about it. And it's very much, I guess it's pretty much accepted that that was one of his primary motivations at that moment, to finally take into his hand, take this project of assassinating Lincoln seriously and go get it done. He had long wanted to either kidnap or assassinate Lincoln. So it wasn't a spur of the moment idea, but this might have been the deciding motivator. This little remark, he said, "Oh, damn, that means Black people will be citizens. We can't have that." And he had a little temper tantrum right there at the site of the speech.
The book is Sheridan's Secret Mission, How the South Won the War After the Civil War. Phil Sheridan was one of the supreme commanders of the Civil War, cavalry officer, very brave, hot-headed, spectacular in the saddle. And that is the nature of where we're headed. The predicate for Sheridan's entry into this, well, he is the commander of the Gulf at one point, then he's the commander of Louisiana and all of this part of the liberated Confederacy, but his headquarters are in Chicago. What happens in July of 1866 follows on what Bob has been talking about, how upsetting it was to the defeated Confederates that the African-American males who are no longer slaves and can no longer be enslaved are going to have a vote same as anyone else in the Confederacy. We come to July 30th, 1866 in New Orleans, and guns are out and open fire. What is the contest, Bob? Why do the townspeople open fire on the militia that's chiefly a black militia?
Well, what happens is they haven't, at that moment, the vote for black people in the South hadn't occurred yet. And this is one of the principal battles along the road to that outcome. As we discussed, Lincoln broached the idea, and he was soon swept from the stage, and Andrew Johnson became president. And Andrew Johnson, just as the war was ending and Southern troops started to go home, Andrew Johnson was in the White House. And he was not of the opinion that black people should have the vote. And in fact, he was a Southerner, and he's from Tennessee, and he shared many of the strong prejudices of white Southerners at that point. And not only that, but he thought that his political future was dependent on getting more of the conservative vote in the nation. So he was opposed to black suffrage, and there was very little idea in the South at that moment of initially in 1865 of awarding voting rights to black people. And once as Johnson was running Reconstruction, and as white Southerners sensed in him a friendship, they began to more or less do as they pleased with their former slaves. When they got back into running the government, they enacted what are known as black codes, which was basically, there were laws against black people holding any but certain occupations. They were, very, very much encouraged to just continue working as agricultural laborers. If they couldn't produce an identification card or some sort of form of identification which told people who their employer was and where they belonged, they could be arrested for vagrancy. And it began to look to Northerners as if this was just another form of slavery happening in 1865. So one of the so-called Unionists in the Southern government at that time proposed that they rewrite this Louisiana Constitution to award voting rights to black people, because he saw that the former Confederates were basically taking over. And the moment you speak about in July 1866, is that where we are?
Yes, yes.
That is the convention that was called to rewrite the Constitution, and everybody knew what they wanted to do. They wanted to award voting rights to black people, and the Southerners felt so threatened by that in Louisiana they staged, well, basically a police riot. I mean, it was the police who were patrolling the city and who were routinely misusing former slaves and, you know, arresting them, beating them up, all manner of abuse. They were guarding the convention, and they started a riot when a group of black conventioneers approached the building with I believe there were a lot of former colored troops in that procession too, but they basically set off a riot, and they were they were shooting up the convention hall. They were shooting up the people coming to go in, you know, sort of dispersing them in the street. And there were I can't remember the death toll, but dozens of black people were killed, and maybe one.
At least 44. There's no accurate count.
Thank you. And maybe one or two of the white policemen were also killed, but I think it's determined that they were probably killed by friendly fire, so-called, meaning their own people.
We're looking at a situation now that's going to get worse, not better, because Lincoln's gone, Johnson's in office, and as Bob says, Johnson is disposed to reassert the Confederacy without slavery. And the people of New Orleans are sympathetic to that. So after this massacre, Congress reacts, and Congress reacts harshly towards Johnson, who is seen as betraying the promises he made when he became vice president. And when we come back quickly through the Reconstruction period to the crisis itself, the book is Sheridan's Secret Mission, How the South Won the War After the Civil War. We're in New Orleans. The massacre takes place in 1866, and following that, there's a series of adjustments that the Congress is making nationally as the nation attempts to heal from the Civil War, where there are hundreds of thousands of dead of disease and wounds, and the whole country is now turned upside down as to how it's going to consist of no longer half slave and half free, but all free. And yet the resistance in the South, especially the southern states, members of the Confederacy, where there was more than 50% African American. And we're concentrating on New Orleans because the record there is clear about the ambition of the freedmen, the free men of Louisiana who want the vote. And the vote means that they're going to vote for people who are Republicans. There have never been Republican successes in the South until now. Bob, the Republican Party at this point, they're sometimes known as Black Republicans, sometimes known as Radical Republicans, and they're passing laws, the Freedmen's Bureau in December 65, the Reconstruction Act in 67, and then they impeach Andrew Johnson for the offense that you've explicated. All of that was seen from the prism of, we're seeing it from the prism of New Orleans. And that introduces us to carpetbaggers. What were the carpetbaggers, Bob?
Well, if you don't mind, I'll step back just a little bit in response to the massacre at the Mechanics Hall. The nation was pretty alarmed. The northern population was pretty alarmed at that, and it wasn't the only incident of that kind. There was another, a similar sort of police riot happened in Memphis, if memory serves. And so the election in 1866 brought big Republican majorities, veto proof, because Andrew Johnson had been vetoing some of the measures that they wanted to put in to help the South and to help African Americans. And so at that point, after that election, the Republicans in Congress passed what was known as radical Reconstruction. And basically what it involved is taking the military back down to some of these Confederate states and ordering them, if they wanted to be part of the Union, to write new state constitutions allowing black people to vote, and that's what happened. And when black people, especially in states with a majority black population, were awarded the vote, they suddenly were running the government. I mean, effectively running the government. And they were carpetbaggers were people from the North who settled in the South, and that was kind of an insulting term developed by white editors in the South, as if to say these are people they just have all that they possess is what they could carry in a carpet bag, is a cheap piece of luggage, and they just came here to swindle ignorant black people to win their votes, because many carpetbaggers ran for office in the southern states and were supported by these newly empowered black electorates. So you found a carpetbagger governor of Louisiana, elected by the majority black electorate, small majority black electorate there. You had a carpetbagger governor in Mississippi. And both of those men were former Union officers. And so the black voters saw them as natural allies, because many black people had fought in the Union Army. 10% of the Union Army were African Americans. So Republican Party gained power across these states in the South when black people got the right to vote. Many of the office holders they voted for were, in fact, other black people, but there were also many white carpetbaggers.
Yes, who were doing such radical things as introducing education.
And they were supporting things like public education, and various things to benefit their voters. But there were also higher taxes on landowning white Southerners, which they very much resented.
March of '67, the Reconstruction Act. What follows is a new constitution for Louisiana.
And all the other southern states. And they, let me get back to your question. Refresh my memory. Where did you?
The carpetbaggers. And what we're doing is we're setting up a tension that didn't exist before, because the former Confederates are reluctant to go along with the fact that they've been defeated and that there's no more slavery. They hold it back. They make allegations. The Republicans become part of the conversation. Louisiana has a state Republican convention in January of '68. They have a contest between a Republican and a Republican. The Democrats are no longer going to gain back their old posts, and there's tension in the state, but there's tension between the Republicans, the so-called fusionists, and the Democrats. In other words, people are being deliberately political, and it's not unhappy that they're doing that. And the impression I got from following your story, Bob, is that there is an evolution underway that may have worked out, but the violence prevented it. And the tragedy that you're telling, well, let's get to the tragedy. Johnson is impeached by the Congress in '67, '68, and they fall one vote short of throwing him out of office, because they're headed to Chicago for the Republican convention, where they're going to choose the general-in-chief of the army to be president, Grant. What does Grant represent to that period? And what does he especially represent to New Orleans? Do they have an opinion of him, Bob?
I think you could safely say that Grant, for the purposes of the Republican Party at that moment, Grant was the most unifying figure they could find. He was beloved by voters of both races, and of course in the largely Democratic South, Grant was a villain. But there were now many black voters. By the time Grant is running in 1868, he was sweeping the black vote in southern states. And so he was basically seen as, if Lincoln was the African American's best friend, he was seen as taking on that mantle when after Lincoln was assassinated. And so, yeah, he was a very important figure, but the election of 1868 was a very bloody affair, a very corrupt affair, especially in Louisiana. And I don't believe, I think that was instigated. That the presidential election in that year was a very bloody affair in Louisiana, but there was an earlier election for state office holders, and in that election, I think what you were referring to is that a Republican governor was selected by the majority black voters, and the response by the Republican-led state government after the 1868 election was to put in place protections to sort of quell the violence and the corruption that was involved in the 1868 election. And the new Republican governor there,
Henry Clay Warmoth, is the man who.
Henry Clay Warmoth, led the way in establishing the Louisiana State Militia, and the Metropolitan Police, which was part of that, which was it was a largely black police force, composed of many former United States colored troops. It wasn't entirely black. There were also many white Southerners who were recruited by a former Confederate general who had now taken the side of the Union here, James Longstreet. But anyway, we're going far afield there. But what happened? There was basically a lot of violence, even after, and especially after, black people were awarded the right to vote. And I think you were referring to the 1872.
Right. And Warmoth is rejected in 72 for William Pitt Kellogg. Everybody has a name from a famous character.
Right.
And the Democrats put up a candidate against Kellogg, and this is the beginning of the catastrophe right now, this contest in 72.
The 1872 contest was one of the safeguards for democratic keeping the democratic character of the election secured, put in by the Republican governor Warmoth, was he empowered the Louisiana legislation by the Republican legislature at that time, empowered the returning board, which counted votes, to toss out votes if they thought that there was too much violence in any given area, and it created doubts about the legitimacy of the vote. And in the 1872 election, the returning board tossed out a number of votes that awarded the election to the Republican candidate. And the Democrats were not of the mind to accept that result. And they basically held a grudge until, never really let go of that grudge. And there was a moment in 1873, I believe, in Colfax, Louisiana, where the Republican government there was assaulted by white vigilantes, and who basically turned it into a massacre of black people to reestablish democratic rule. And it was reversed, but it was probably the biggest racial massacre in United States history, if memory serves.
Right, with at least 70 dead, executed, shot in the back of the head. The Colfax on the Red River in what was called Grant Parish. We've now come to the second massacre. So what is to be done? First thing you need to do is deal with General Grant, who's now President of the United States of America. The book is Sheridan's Secret Mission, How the South Won the War After the Civil War. Robert Cwiklik is the author. Stable, they fall apart. This is now 73 is the Colfax Massacre, April 73. We're now in 74, and there's going to be another election, but the White League, called the Crescent City White League, is in the field. And that White League means to dominate and intimidate the Republicans in the South and the African Americans who are voting in the South. And we now come to a battle scene that is going to trigger Grant finally to move. They read about these things and they stay back. There's a occupation of the South. The Union Army is present, but it can't stop. There's not enough of them to police the South. So we come to, this is September of 74, the run up to the next election for governor and state posts in Louisiana. It's called the Battle of Liberty Place. This is where James Longstreet, who was a classmate of Grant's at West Point. Longstreet was on the field in Gettysburg. You will recall he was an intimate with both Grant and Lee, but he is now on the side of the Angels, commanding the militia to maintain order in New Orleans. And Bob, I'll turn the story over to you because this is another tragedy. Who are the objectors that day to the Republican domination of the state? Who fights back?
Well, what happened was in spite of the Colfax massacre in 1873, the overall situation in the South was becoming more manageable because of the so-called Reconstruction amendments, one of which, the 14th Amendment, appeared to give Congress the ability to more or less police Black rights in the South. And they had passed legislation known as the Enforcement Act, which was used to send federal agents and troops to defeat the Ku Klux Klan, largely in South Carolina. And so the Colfax massacre represented a kind of, it was more of an aberration at the time that it happened. But there was overall a feeling that things could work out in the South if they maintained the enforcement powers of the North, of the federal government. However, the Colfax massacre quickly became a court case, and with a lot of the perpetrators of that massacre were arrested and tried. And during the trial of the Colfax criminals, the Colfax terrorists, there was an interim verdict, which the defense had raised the possibility that these enforcement acts were unconstitutional, and the judge, who was a circuit judge from the Supreme Court, writing, in those days they would oversee federal court proceedings along their circuits for part of the year. And he was involved in that case, and he issued an opinion that suggested that, this could be. It could be that the enforcement powers of the North that awarded by Congress had run afoul of the Constitution. But that was not the final word on the matter. That was bound for the Supreme Court, that particular case of the Colfax criminals. But that opinion by that judge was seen as a kind of a green light to a lot of Southern whites. And they started much more aggressively to organize resistance to the idea of black suffrage. And within, I think, not too many weeks after that opinion, there was White League was incorporated in New Orleans, the Crescent City White League, which is what you were speaking of, and they quickly rose to prominence. Of all the White League was basically an armed vigilante,
Right,
and
and took over the government. They drove Kellogg, the governor, out of town and opened fire on Longstreet and the militia.
they indeed opened fire on Longstreet and the Metropolitan Police Force, which was part of the Louisiana State Militia. And not only was the Crescent City White League involved in that, but there were thousands of White Leaguers from across the state. There were various chapters of the White League across the state.
8,300 is the number you give, and 83 is an army. In other words, it's another rebellion, and the White House hears about it, and therein lies the next step in the tale. The book is Sheridan's Secret Mission: How the South Won the War After the Civil War. Bob Cwiklik is the author. New Orleans is now in chaos. The White League, numbering in the thousands, have driven the elected governor, Kellogg, from the city. He's run for his life. James Longstreet has been wounded. The hero of the Confederacy has been wounded by men who claim to be standing up for sovereignty, for law, along with his second in command, who's also very badly wounded. They opened fire on legitimate troops representing the governor and the federal government itself. Grant, in the White House, this is the 74 election, sees that something must be done. However, the election is at hand, and what happens is that Grant's administration is badly beaten in the Congress. This is midterm election. And the House of Representatives is now going to move to the Democrats for the first time since the Civil War. The Senate remains Republican. Grant still knows that he must act. And so, Bob, thank you for this. Who is Sheridan to Grant? What is their relationship? What's it based upon? Because Sheridan is commanding the part of the country that includes New Orleans, but he's based in Chicago. What does Grant want him to do? Why does Grant trust him? Thank you.
Well, that's by the time he turns to Sheridan, all hell is breaking loose in the South. When the White League occupied New Orleans, they were quickly dealt with by Grant. He sent troops by the gazillion down there. Well, you probably have the number in front of you, but he sent thousands of troops. He sent warships up the Mississippi. He basically put a stop to that. He put a lid on that. So
regiment, Gatling guns, cannons, warships. He deploys the U.S. military.
He was pissed, if you can say that on the radio. And that took care of that. The Louisiana Republican governor was back in the saddle within days. Grant was not going to put up with that. However, he also didn't have any interest in reoccupying the South. But when the White League took over New Orleans, there were only, basically, I'm not sure of the exact number, but there were maybe dozens of Union troops left in the city at that time. It wasn't an occupation. And after that battle, as you say, the Republicans lost control of the House of Representatives for the first time since the Civil War. So a lot of Republicans believed that this aggressive action on the part of Northern troops in Louisiana to put down the White League, a lot of them were of the opinion that actions like that were beginning to try the patience of the Northern electorate, and that and I think that put a little bit of that put a little caution in Grant's soul too, and he knew that this was an ongoing problem, and it was after the White League attack on New Orleans, there were other incidents as well. In Vicksburg, Mississippi, there was basically another band of armed vigilantes that drove a black Republican sheriff out of office. There were white leaguers in other parts of Louisiana who had also who had also thrown out local officials, Republican officials there. And there was a lot of worry that through the actions of violent white vigilantes would gradually overthrow the newly won voting rights and thereafter most of the other rights of African American citizens in the South. And around December of 1874, when there was a lot of talk among Southern Republicans, both black and white, that something more had to be done. That because the Republicans had lost control of the House of Representatives, they feared that if something wasn't done quickly, that the Democrats taking over the House of Representatives would block further action to enforce black rights in the South. And so that something had to happen. And Grant was very alive to the newly active white militias like the White League. And so he decided to enlist the services of someone he knew he could trust, and that's Phil Sheridan. And the reason that he was such a natural for, here's an era when all the gains of the Civil War, what they called the fruits of victory, were obviously imperiled. And another time that seemed to be the case in Grant's memory was in 1864, when he was a head general of Union forces. Lincoln was coming up for election, and Lincoln believed that he was going to lose the election, and there would go. He also believed that would imperil the emancipation of African Americans, and other gains that they had achieved in the war thus far. But there was, even though the Union generals were confident that they were ultimately going to win, at that moment there were a lot of setbacks for Union forces, and Grant called on Sheridan to go after some of the Confederate raiders that had been troubling the northern lines, because he knew that he was a very feisty young general who basically knew how to put a lid on the situation. And so there was in fact, Union forces did rally. Lincoln did win the election. Sheridan was a big part of that. So it was only natural that Grant, at another moment when everything was on the line, that he would reach out for Sheridan. And so he sent a telegram. He had his Secretary of War send a telegram to Sheridan and say, look, go down to New Orleans, pretend you're on vacation, and take a look around, and go to these other cities as well in the South that were experiencing a lot of white vigilante behavior, and take a look and tell me what we can do. Give me your opinion about what we can do to put a lid on this.
The success now is that these two men trust each other. And if this was a Hollywood movie, they'd be victorious because they're both heroes. But, and I note, Bob, Grant didn't share what he was up to. This was a secret mission that only Belknap was read into. He didn't tell his cabinet.
He did. I should have mentioned that. He had his Secretary of War Belknap send a telegram to Sheridan and tell him, just report back to me, and pretend this is a vacation. Grant did not tell his other cabinet officers, and that is particularly notable that he didn't tell Hamilton Fish, his Secretary of State, because basically Hamilton Fish was his, I think, the person he looked to for advice most frequently.
Yes, and now we introduce the hero himself. The book is Sheridan's Secret Mission. The African Americans in the South were terrorized. They had written Grant pleading for help in September. Well, finally, Grant rallies himself after having lost the Congress, knowing that his last 2 years in office are going to be very difficult with the hostile Democratic House of Representatives. However, he sends a telegram through his Secretary of War, and Sheridan knows that everybody's going to recognize him, but he takes a large entourage, including his his almost fiancée, Irene, which I loved him for, and goes to the St. Charles Hotel in New Orleans. He knows the territory very well. Bob, when they saw Sheridan wander into town, did they doubt why he was there?
Oh, they sure did. There was no Southerner who knew who Sheridan wasn't immediately suspicious of why he was arriving in town. When he got off the train, there were already people there had already been speculation when he was riding the train to the South that he was up to no good there from the Southern point of view, that he was there to sort of to cause trouble for the Southern states. And what the Daily Picayune, the newspaper of New Orleans, the white conservative newspaper, said Sheridan had insisted this was just a pleasure trip. And the Daily Picayune said, purely a pleasure trip, only this and nothing more, with obvious overtones of based sarcasm. And they didn't believe it for a minute, is all I will say. But and in fact, he was there to scope out the threat of white vigilantism. But his mission did not remain secret for very long.
Yes, now he's in town smoking a cigar at the St. Charles Hotel, and the state convention is going to gather, the gathering of their House of Representatives is going to gather at the St. Louis Hotel right after New Year. Sheridan takes the train south before Christmas. He arrives the day before the New Year, so the last day of 1874. It's now 1875. They're gathering at the St. Louis Hotel to organize the legislature. And there's a game on that Sheridan doesn't know. What's the game that the white leaders are playing, Bob?
Well, what the vote in the election was extremely close in the November election. And this was going to be the first day of organizing the legislature. Now, the Republicans had been in charge of the legislature the previous session, so they were going to be running this show while the new legislature was sworn in. And the vote was highly contested, as it always was in Louisiana. The Democrats claimed that the returning board threw out too many votes, claiming that there was violence and fraud. And in the end, there was a tie in the legislature, and there were several seats that had to be chosen by the members of who would run them. And if the Republicans maintained control of the floor, they would just engineer the voting in the Republicans to those 5 contested seats. So what the Democrats did was they staged basically a violent overthrow of the House of Representatives before any of that could happen, before the House could be organized. And so, and there were people with armed individuals came into the floor as they basically took hold of the rostrum and said, okay, we're electing a speaker, we're going to control this place. And they were helped by armed men who were thought to be White League vigilantes. And so while all that was going on, basically a coup d'etat in the House of Representatives, State House of Representatives, Sheridan was just down the street. And he was sitting in with the local commander of Union forces who had been there since the White League takeover several months earlier. And he said to the Republican governor was asking for the assistance of Union troops to go into the legislature and take out any people who were there who weren't elected. Basically, five white Democrats who had taken seats illegally. And Sheridan was sitting there and said, I would do it if I were you. He was just sitting there as a citizen. He wasn't in charge at that point. He hadn't taken command, but everybody knew who he was. And the local commander followed his advice and sent troops into the hall of the Louisiana legislature to remove people who had not been selected by the Louisiana Returning Board. And that later that day, Sheridan communicated his feelings about all of that to the world. Did you want me to talk about that?
That's fine, but I just want to make certain we understand that the White Leaguers set this up to make certain that the Union would send troops in. That's what they wanted. That was the
Well,
that
that's definitely a theory, and that's what a lot of local Republicans believed, and I believe that was reported in a couple of newspapers. That is pretty, that's informed speculation, but there was definitely a plan afoot, and there were definitely troops in the neighborhood, so you could easily make that surmise.
yes,
What were they going to do?
the colonel in charge was named Trobriand, and he said to the participants, we need you to not make threats to the rest of the legislature. And these 5 men have to leave. And the White Leaguers, we presume that's who they were, said, well, they're not going to leave without you dragging them out. So the soldiers, each with a bayonet on their rifles, as the scene Bob describes, to put their arms on each of 5 men, nothing rough, and they marched them out. But that scene becomes very useful to the Democrats in Congress, to the White Leaguers in Louisiana, and throughout the South, the White Liners in Mississippi. Everybody's going to turn that scene into a drama and make the White Leaguers the victims. When we come back, how so? And what does Sheridan do about it? Bob Cwiklik is the author. Sheridan's Secret Mission, How the South Won the War After the Civil War. It's not secret anymore. This is the drama that I did not have until I read Bob's book. How is it that the success of the Civil War for the Union side, for freeing the slaves, for holding the Union together, how is it that it turned into what became, for the balance of the century, into more than half of the 20th century and beyond, a brutal, segregated South? How did that happen? Here is the story. The White Leaguers of Louisiana have arranged in some fashion that it appears that Union troops have interfered in the legislation of a sovereign state. This is extremely shocking to the way Congress understands its role at the time, then. We've had a lot of history since then. Bob, we need to go to the telegrams, the banditti telegrams that General Sheridan, and not very much disguise, sends to his boss, the Secretary of War, Mr. Belknap. The one I like, he sends one out on the 4th right away. But on the 5th is the one I like, and I'll read the line that becomes a rallying cry for the villains. If Congress would pass a bill declaring them banditti, they could be tried by a military commission. The ringleaders of this banditti, who murdered men here on the 14th of last September, and also more recently at Vicksburg, Mississippi, should, in justice to law and order and the peace and prosperity of this southern part of the country, be punished. It is possible that if the president would issue a proclamation declaring them banditti, no further action need be taken except that which would devolve upon me. In other words, our hero is ready to ride just the way he did in the Shenandoah Valley. He's ready to ride, and he has the army to do it, and he'll arrest every one of them and put them on trial as military prisoners, as men who have been outlaws on military prisoners. I think, Bob, the way this telegram reads, he means to hang them.
Well, there were a lot of Southerners who read it the same way. And now you picture a guy, Sheridan was a hero in the North. He was a Civil War hero. But he rolled into town on vacation, trying not to make a big noise. And here he is announcing to the world that he wants to ride after these white leaguers. Now, white leaguers were more or less, from the South's point of view, respectable citizens. They weren't wearing hoods like the Ku Klux Klan of years earlier. They were basically had a much better public image. And the idea of first of Northern troops clanking through a Southern state legislature and yanking Southern lawmakers forcefully yanking them out. That didn't sit well with Northerners. The idea of Sheridan popping off like this, saying, I want to arrest these white leaguers, I want to put them on trial. This is basically, in people's minds, they're thinking, this sounds like a kangaroo court situation here. So the reaction to Sheridan, the war hero's intervention at this moment was highly negative. And it set off what if memory serves, they were meetings called indignation meetings in several cities in the North, denouncing him for doing this. And the impetus for some of this was just a weariness with the entire Civil War project after all these years, and with continually having to intervene in the South to put down violence against African Americans. There was some weariness against that. But this is also after years of Southerners smearing white carpetbaggers in the South, saying that they were there to just cause trouble and to reap the to make a killing, cheating people and everything. So for many reasons, Sheridan's intervention, Sheridan's banditti telegram didn't go over well with the Northern public. And that was, this episode basically became one of the biggest, one of the most destructive episodes as far as souring public opinion on the entire project of guaranteeing, enforcing the rights of African Americans after the Civil War and during Reconstruction. This was a big wound to that entire effort, a big setback.
Let's go to the Missouri Senator Carl Schurz, a hero of the Revolution of 1848 in Europe. He fled rather than be shot down. And he's now a senator from Missouri, who was a Civil War hero as well. But on several days later, I believe it's on the 11th of January, he makes a well-announced speech in the U.S. Senate denouncing Sheridan, denouncing Grant, denouncing the Union Army, saying this intervention is unconstitutional and lawless. I would think the quotes here are again and again. So what you introduced me to, Bob, is the opportunism that the Republican Party took on this episode. It's not just Democrats now. Everybody's going to turn it into a useful tool to advance their own cause. What did Schurz want to achieve by by telling a tale that wasn't quite accurate?
Well, I think his motivations have remained uh, in question for a long time. No one, I don't think anybody has really nailed it down, but you can look at just the basic political motivations. Sheridan, I'm sorry, Carl Schurz is now a senator from Missouri. Now, he has lost his bid for reelection in the previous election, but one can assume he's still responding to a largely, yeah, and senators at that moment were chosen by the state legislature, not by popular vote. But he's still responding to cues from his constituents, which are Southern white men, mainly. And so there's also the idea that among many Republicans that, okay, Reconstruction has gone on long enough. Maybe it's time to pare back. Maybe there was a feeling afoot that you just couldn't change these hard attitudes of Southern whites in such a brief period of time, that it might take a generation or two before they were willing to accept this project. So whatever he was of the opinion, I believe, that a militarized presence in the South after all these years was counterproductive. And although he was very supportive of it immediately after the war, on the other hand, immediately after the war, he didn't have a Southern constituency. He wasn't a senator from Missouri. I'm not sure where, I forget where he was living at that point, but I think it was in the North. In any case, his motives are a little bit open to question, but it was clear that he was not supportive of continuing aggressive Reconstruction measures.
Grant has to make a decision. Sheridan is sent via Belknap that I will take charge of this, and Grant knows what that means. Remember, Sheridan burned the valley in order to win the war. This is a man who practices total war. So Grant has a decision to make, and he needs to address his cabinet before, and we're now January 13th. All this is happening within days.
Well, Grant has been called upon by the United States Senate to explain his actions, the actions of the United States forces in Louisiana. And so he's got to respond to the Senate. And it's widely believed that in that response, he will also state his position on the program that Sheridan has laid out in his banditti telegrams, which the entire nation has read at this point. And they've all read that Sheridan wants to go down there and round up all these white leaguers and the people who are threatening the newly won rights of African Americans, that Sheridan is calling for them to be rounded up and tried before military tribunals and to get the situation under control. When Grant addresses Congress, it is believed that he will also address that proposal. And he indeed does. Grant goes before the Congress. Notably, he does not apologize for what the Union or the United States military forces did in Louisiana. And he said, look, if you don't want, words to the effect of, if you don't want soldiers restoring order, then don't send a mob into the legislature to take it over, or words to that effect. And he cited a lot of atrocities that had happened in the South that were still unresolved. The murderers of Colfax still had not been brought to justice. Various other, horrible atrocities had. There was apparently no way to bring these people to justice. He commented to that effect. But when it came to Sheridan's proposal for more aggressive action by Northern forces, he said, look, maybe what he proposed is not strictly legal right now. He's not a lawyer. He's a soldier. But if it were legal, in other words, if the legislation could be produced to give extraordinary powers to the government, as it had been a few years earlier, then Grant had no doubt that it would work. But he did not endorse it.
The Enforcement Act that we now remember as the Ku Klux Klan Act, that expired in 1871. So we'd need Congress to vouchsafe, again, federal interference in a local election process. This is the way it was seen from Washington.
What had expired in particular was the ability of Grant to set aside the writ of habeas corpus as he combated vigilante terrorism. That had expired. Much of the rest of the legislation had been cast under a cloud by the judge's opinion I mentioned earlier.
So here are two heroes, Grant, who saved the Union, and Sheridan, who saved Grant. And the decision must be made, and it's now the 13th of January. And when we come back, surprise. Robert Cwiklik is the author, Sheridan's Secret Mission, How the South Won the War After the Civil War. Sheridan wants to round up the rascals and punish them and stop the damage to the African Americans that is constant, daily terror. How the South won the war after the Civil War. Grant has made his proposal to the Senate saying, I'm not going to apologize. People who did the Colfax, the Mechanics Hall, the Colfax Massacre, the Vicksburg Massacre, they're going unpunished. Something must be done. And waiting for Grant's word at the St. Charles Hotel, where our hero Sheridan is staying, and everybody concerned about his safety, but he's not. He's smoking a cigar waiting for the Grant's telegram. And Bob, what is the decision by the President of the United States?
Well, when it becomes evident that Ulysses S. Grant, the man who saved the Union, hero of the Civil War, preeminent hero of the Civil War, he has decided not to pursue General Sheridan's mission, at least at this moment. He gives no indication, and he plainly says that if it were legal, that would be the way to go. But he's clearly suggesting this ain't happening, at least at this moment. When the telegram then starts clacking wildly, and the message over the telegram is Grant backs down. That's the message that is received in the room where Sheridan is standing. And a telegraph operator screams that message out to the assembled various white Southerners, including prominent white leaguers. What they're hearing in the presence of Sheridan is that he's not being supported by Grant in his desire to put down the White League. And up until that moment, there had been much speculation that after Grant spoke, maybe he'd start arresting people. Maybe he'd start right away. So this was clearly a turning point. But it was seen as, basically Grant didn't want to pursue this aggressive policy at this moment. At that moment, the war was lost. Well, it basically it was a big turning point in Reconstruction. There were still a few more innings to play out, but it was big. When I say Grant had not abandoned hope of an aggressive response, but he saw this was not the moment for it, and he didn't really have the firepower, the legislative firepower for it. He was convinced by his cabinet that doing what Sheridan called for was not legal right now. But he did immediately move what Congress the Republicans in Congress tried to pass legislation enabling a more aggressive response, to restore powers that Grant had had a few years earlier when he put down the Ku Klux Klan. But it failed.
It failed because the Congress dragged its feet until the Democrats were in the House of Representatives in March. Remember, March is the turnover now.
Right.
That's January now, but it was March in that day. And the
Exactly.
Democrats were not going to permit any legislation in any fashion that would contradict the White League and all the other rascals of the South. Now, there's a revelation you provide, Bob. In 1875, Grant's still in office. In 1875, a young man of mixed descent, free man of color, Jerome Lynch, I think it's Jerome Lynch. Lynch is his name.
Not John R. Lynch, yes.
John R. Lynch comes to the White House to interview the president, and Grant sits with him. And John R. Lynch, who publishes this in 1913, this is a codicil to Bob's book. It's very nice. John R. Lynch is bold enough to say, Mr. President, why did you make this decision to back away from the White League? Sheridan was ready. Everybody was ready for you to do the right thing. Why? Why did he, Bob?
And in fact, it came closer to home for John R. Lynch because he was a public official in Mississippi. He was, I believe, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, in the State House of Representatives in Mississippi.
We just have a minute, Bob. So why
Okay.
did
And his government was thrown out of office by White League style people the year after, or that the year after this happened in Louisiana. And at that time, there was Grant, pursuant to this new policy after Sheridan's mission, it did not act as quickly as he might have to send troops. Therefore, the Mississippi Republicans were doomed. And Grant didn't send those troops, and he confessed that to Lynch in that Oval Office visit, or in that White House visit, because he was worried about the effect of doing so on the state elections in Ohio, where they believed that a man named it was Rutherford B. Hayes who was running for governor at that moment, and they had high hopes for him in the future. And he didn't want to toss away an important election for sending troops which he wasn't sure could succeed in their mission.
In other words, Grant made a decision to endorse the next president of the United States. The book is Sheridan's Secret Mission, How the South Won the War After the Civil War. Robert Cwiklik is the author. I'm John Batchelor.